Greetings. Welcome to Anime Octopus. I am pleased to have you join me on my YouTube channel. Today's fanfic topic is What if Naruko kissed her sensei? Part 4. Please note, the content presented on this channel is intended solely for entertainment and discussion. I do not claim ownership of any anime footage featured in my videos. All rights and credits belong to their respective creators and copyright holders. Let's begin. The days that followed seemed interminable as the village continued its restoration efforts. The villagers found their tasks increasingly disrupted by the condition of their beloved hero, Naruko. Her resilience and determination had always inspired them, and despite the hardship, they strived to carry on, motivated by the thought of her encouragement. Naruko's room was perpetually bustling with visitors. Each morning, Ino would bring a fresh bouquet of flowers, including alstroemeria for friendship, peonies for health, and gladiolus for strength. Neji, Lee, and Tenten would follow, filling the room with lively conversation to ensure that Naruko was not left in silence. Tsunade would spend time tending to Naruko, allowing Kakashi to take brief respites to care for himself. She would gently brush her goddaughter's hair, cleanse her skin, and apply a hint of blush in hopes of restoring some color to her pallid complexion. Meanwhile, Kakashi would gather small tokens from around Konoha, stones from their favorite training grounds, pebbles from the river, and wildflowers from nearby clearings. Despite Naruko's immobility, he wanted her to feel connected to the vibrant life of the village. He placed these treasures around her room, seeking to brighten her environment with the world she could no longer experience firsthand. Sakura eventually found the fortitude to hold back her tears during her visits, sitting beside Naruko and recounting her daily experiences, much like they used to do over afternoon tea. Sasuke would accompany her, offering a steady hand on her shoulder and standing silently behind her with his gaze fixed on his teammate. The only sign of communication between Sasuke and Kakashi was a brief nod before Sasuke would leave. Choji would bring Kakashi lunch, and Shikamaru would insist on a game of shogi, playfully tousling Naruko's hair in a futile attempt to rouse her. Shino would place a beetle under Naruko's pillow, monitoring her chakra levels for any anomalies, while Neji frequently returned to ensure everything was in order. Kakashi would observe Neji with a detached gaze, allowing him to carry out his duties uninterrupted. Although Kiba did not return, Akamaru would come to comfort Naruko during Hinata's visits, keeping her warm. Hinata would read to both Naruko and Kakashi in the evenings, easing Kakashi into a light sleep. She would gently squeeze Naruko's hand, hoping to transfer some of her own strength to her friend and imploring her to awaken. The absence of Naruko was taking its toll on Konoha. As night fell and others retreated to their homes, Kakashi would awaken from his rest and press his forehead against the back of Naruko's hand. He would count her pulse, kiss her wrist, and whisper her name against her forehead before sinking back into his chair, weighed down by his grief. He would fall asleep in the same position, his head resting on her hand, as if seeking forgiveness for his perceived failures. Despite the physical discomfort and the persistent ache in his joints, he could not bring himself to sleep without holding her hand. It was both his refuge and his penance, and he embraced this ritual with unwavering devotion. Kakashi's vigil was marked by a quiet desperation. With each passing day, Naruko's condition deteriorated. Her once vibrant physique had become frail, her bones visible beneath her skin, which had turned even paler than Kakashi's own. Her once robust muscles had withered from disuse, and her lips were cracked and dry despite Tsunade's efforts. It was as if death had touched her, casting her in the shades of decay. There were no breakthroughs or successful treatments, each day brought a further decline in her condition. As time passed, Kakashi's own health faltered. He found no rest in sleep, could not stomach food, and only rose from his chair to collapse back into it, burdened by defeat. He stagnated alongside Naruko, and in this state of despair, Konoha seemed to lose both its hero and her steadfast protector. Tsunade had sequestered herself away when she was not with her goddaughter. She herself bore all the countenance of when she had lost Dan, Nawaki, and Jiraiya. Her once certain steps now faltered. Her steady hands could only tremble as they clutched around a glass of sake. The Hokage Tower had closed its doors for she was incapable of bearing the guilt at being so weak in the face of the entire village. Konoha lost its hero, her shield, and now their leader, and the gravity of the situation threatened to undo the village from its core. Each passing day grew increasingly daunting, and every moment seemed more futile than the last. Restoration efforts waned as attention shifted to the hospital ward, where all awaited their hero's emergence, hoping for a ray of light to dispel the prevailing gloom. For Naruko, however, silence prevailed. In the midst of darkness, a fleeting flash of light emerged, a glimpse of obsidian and garnet eyes, silver hair, and a laugh reminiscent of summer rain. A gentle touch, a warm caress, a shared breath between parted lips. And then, like the first bloom of spring, a name, Kakashi. Yes, she had a date, or rather an outing, with Kakashi. She reminded herself to be cautious with her labeling to avoid scaring him away. She didn't want him to retreat, for without him, she felt an aching void. With him, she was whole and content. That was before the darkness, before her world turned black. The room spun beneath her, her vision blurred. In a moment of alarm, she called out for Kurama, her voice breaking mid-heartbeat. He seemed to be drifting further from her, deeper into the abyss. She reached out with outstretched arms, but her 10 fingers were soon engulfed by the darkness, followed by her wrists, elbows, until all that remained was black. Amidst the memory's disarray, Naruko understood she needed to find Kurama to escape this void, yet she couldn't extricate herself from the darkness. She tried to call for him but choked on the emptiness. Every effort to rise only led to deeper despair, her strength draining away. She curled up, overwhelmed by the sound of her own heartbeat, feeling like an orphan once again, homeless, an outcast, a demon. Thus, Naruko remained, entombed in years of isolation. Then, from beyond the darkness, she heard him. His voice, though distant, called her name, once, twice, a third time, until it washed over her like a wave. She could feel him as if his breath were against her skin. His touch at the crook of her elbow, the tremor against her neck, and his voice grew more poignant as he whispered her name against her forehead. His lips trembled as they grazed her cheek, and his hand seemed to anchor her to reality. Kakashi. In that moment, the loneliness was lifted from her heart. Naruko found it curious. She questioned whether someone had sealed her consciousness. She extended her mind, seeking any foreign chakra, but found none. She considered the possibility of a genjutsu but met with failure in her attempts to dispel it. If an external force was responsible, she had to commend the user's cunning. Nevertheless, Naruko refused to surrender and focused on finding a way out of her predicament. Realizing that she could not awaken herself, Naruko directed her attention to those around her. She felt the wetness of tears on her skin, the softness of Ino's flowers brushing her chin, and the gentle, nurturing hands reaching for her. She could hear Hinata's readings and Sakura's daily updates, responding in kind though they couldn't hear her. She even growled when Shikamaru ruffled her hair. The room's atmosphere was palpable with the tension of despair waging against hope. She sighed when hope faltered and Kakashi bowed his head to her hand, weeping. Her heart ached with her inability to comfort him. Throughout her life, she had striven to protect her loved ones, but now, for the first time, she felt utterly powerless. Gaara's roar of rage shattered the darkness. The blackness exploded into vivid reds, causing Naruko to clutch her chest in an attempt to ease her anguish. Suddenly, she felt Shukaku's persistent touch and the echo of his laughter, lifting her from the darkness into a new consciousness. As her eyes opened, the world around her was blinding. Having been immersed in darkness for so long, the brilliance of this mindscape was overwhelming. Her eyes strained as the colors coalesced into recognizable shapes. She soon realized she was in the realm where Kurama resided deep within her mind. Naruko stumbled to her feet. It took her 3 tries before her knees stopped buckling beneath her and she could walk without faltering. She looked at the scenery before her and smiled fondly at the memory of her and Kurama redecorating the space. There was no longer the sewer-like canal riddled with iron prison bars. There was grass beneath her feet, a sky so blue it matched her eyes, and an endless expanse to the horizon littered with trees. He had devoted some of his chakra into increasing the space, and every day there was something new to be seen. It made it bearable for him, and allowed he and Naruko the quiet necessary to reconnect with one another. She scoured the area before her, driven by an urgent need to locate Kurama. Her last memory was of him drifting away, and she was consumed with anxiety for his safety. Her concern was compounded by guilt associated with the location where Kurama had been originally imprisoned. She longed to comfort him, to press a kiss to his snout, and seek his forgiveness. Only then could she hope to awaken from her current state and move forward. After what seemed like an interminable search, Naruko finally found Kurama. Her voice, hoarse from calling out, was met with silence, causing her to panic. As she approached, she saw that Kurama was asleep. Her attempts to rouse him were in vain, he remained unresponsive. Frustrated, she tried to channel her chakra, but when her familiar power did not respond, she ran her hands through her hair in exasperation and yelled. Realizing that a tantrum would not be productive, Naruko settled beside Kurama's neck. She wove her fingers through his fur, appreciating its softness and warmth. The fur, a burnt orange reminiscent of glowing embers, was soothing to the touch. As she stroked behind his ear, she giggled at the way it twitched. It was only when her fingers gently caressed his cheek that she realized how exhausted she was. She murmured his name as sleep overtook her. The dreams that followed were not her own. She saw a young fox kit surrounded by 8 other beasts. The sage of the 6 paths, Hagoromo, spoke to her, his ancient voice echoing in her mind. The scenes shifted rapidly, Kurama abandoning his siblings, declaring himself superior with his 9 tails, Kurama as a force of devastation, tearing apart countries, Madara controlling him, using the fox as a weapon of destruction. Kurama writhed in futile resistance against Madara's dominion, reduced from a powerful entity to a mere instrument of chaos. When Hashirama Senju liberated him, Kurama almost expressed gratitude, but Hashirama had other plans. Upon Madara's defeat, Hashirama imprisoned Kurama, chaining him to Mito Uzumaki, the first of his Jinchuriki. Kurama fought against the chains, clawed at the walls of his prison, and roared in defiance, only to be met with silence. Naruko observed as the scenes transitioned from Mito to Kushina, where Kurama was once again bound and silenced. She could understand his bitterness, years of isolation and hatred had shaped his demeanor. She, too, would have succumbed to despair if no one had acknowledged her. The dream abruptly shifted as a cry of anguish pierced the vision. Naruko gasped at the sight. Kurama's claw impaled both her parents, blood staining the air as a baby cried. Her mother's hair fell forward as if reaching for the infant, while her father choked, his golden hair falling still as his head rested on her mother's shoulder. His smile pooled with crimson, his eyes dimming. Naruko's gasp turned into a cry as she extended her hand towards her parents, only to withdraw it in anguish. She fell to her knees, pressing her palms against her temples, desperately trying to erase the harrowing memory. The pain was overwhelming, she wept, consumed by it. As the memory faded, Kurama appeared before her, his expression etched with remorse. He wrapped a tail around Naruko in a silent apology, imploring her to open her eyes. When she finally met his gaze, he was unable to bear the horror reflected there. His usually steady voice trembled with guilt. "I cannot move past this moment," he admitted, his words breaking with each syllable as though speaking was a burden. "I see all the ways I failed you, and it didn't matter back then." A howl resonated in the distance, a reminder of Kurama's sealing within her, the memory of her own seal pulsing painfully. "I didn't know," he continued, shaking his head as if to dispel his actions. "I didn't know, Naruko." The great fox lowered his head between his paws, hiding his face from her. "It is all I see now," he murmured, his breath quivering with despair. Naruko's eyes, reflecting the depths of the Caspian Sea, fractured under the weight of her grief. She witnessed the moment her parents' lives were extinguished, their blonde and crimson hair still in motion as their light faded. The sacrifice was profound, her parents for a demon, a decision no rational person would ever accept. She hadn't made the choice, she wept, and now, how could she ever erase the memory of their death? How could she rid herself of an image so starkly imprinted in her mind? She pressed her palms into her eyes, desperate to displace the haunting vision. Her heart shattered within her chest, and her breath caught in her throat. A distant whimpering echoed in her ears, unfamiliar and jarring. Her hands fell to her sides, powerless. She blinked and focused on the figure before her. Kurama's ears were back, his face contorted with pain, and his massive shoulders trembled under the weight of his sorrow. He was crying. Naruko gasped out his name, scrambled to her knees, and reached out with a trembling hand, touching his soft fur. She pressed her lips to the space between his eyes, repeating a broken mantra, "O Kurama." Her voice laden with grief. It was profoundly sorrowful that she had spent so long fixated on her own suffering, never once considering the toll it took on Kurama. He, the ember-hued fox draped in eons of power, bound to a mortal who failed to acknowledge him for 3 lifetimes. To have been neglected for so long, to have been silenced, how desperately he must have longed for a fragment of freedom. How misunderstood and feared he must have been, when all he sought was a glance in his direction and a listening ear. Look how far such recognition had taken them. He was no longer confined, he remained by choice, and he assisted her, guided her, nurtured her. Kurama had become her steadfast companion, her unwavering friend, her most cherished confidant. They lived and suffered together, and he had become invaluable and deeply cherished to her. Kurama was not born to spread bloodshed and chaos, he only wreaked havoc when his captors failed to acknowledge him. The price he paid to be heard was exorbitant and tragic. Tears fell unbidden from her eyes. "You couldn't have known," she whispered through her sobs, "no one understood each other, how could you have done anything differently?" She cried. "How else could you have finally been free?" Naruko clung to Kurama, her form shaking as she held him tightly, struggling against the weight of her sorrow. He was her sole anchor in the sea of despair. "I forgive you," she managed through the pressure in her chest, feeling as though her heart might break. "I forgive you," she murmured against his muzzle, her lips pressed gently against his snout. "I forgive you," she repeated as she kissed the corners of his eyes. The salt of her tears mingled with his, a bitter taste of shared anguish. "You didn't know, Kurama?" she said, steadying her hand over his eyes, pleading for him to look at her. Only when his ruby eyes met hers did she continue, her expression one of heartfelt apology. "Never in any of your lifetimes," she whispered as her hands rested beneath his muzzle, "have your captors sought your forgiveness." Naruko bowed her head against his face, her blonde hair falling forward, obscuring his view until he saw only the blue and gold that symbolized Naruko. She rested her cheek against his nose and nuzzled him, her bangs brushing his snout. "I am so sorry, Kurama," she said as her tears mingled with his fur, the moisture soaking into his skin. "How lonely it must have been," she choked out, her voice breaking with suppressed sobs, "how cruel we were." Her sorrow opened the floodgates, and she shook against him, her tears streaming down his jaw. Despite finding a way into the coldness of Kurama's heart, she could not forgive herself or those before her for their treatment of him. Kurama's captors had been no better than the villagers were to her, and she could not fathom enduring such isolation. The neglect she faced from Konoha had nearly overwhelmed her, it was no wonder that Kurama had unleashed his fury. Kurama stared in disbelief at the woman weeping over him. Never had he imagined a human, let alone a mere child, offering an apology for the years of his imprisonment. She had scarcely matured before she had saved the world. He would never forget her blue eyes, serene amid the chaos of a world ending, as she smiled and extended her hand, promising they would overcome it together. He was immensely proud of her as she sealed Kaguya and lifted Sasuke from the same hatred that had plagued him. How dazzling she was, how brilliant, how transcendent. He took pride in their symbiotic relationship, knowing that with her will, the world could crumble beneath her feet. He never thought he would assist a human in healing the planet and mending broken hearts. She performed it as though it were an art, her very essence resonating with life, radiating warmth to all who beheld her. Kurama, the nine-tailed Baijuwu, had entrusted his heart to a mere child. In those tender moments as the girl wept over him, Kurama realized he had loved her with the certainty of his lifetimes. He had found his home in the girl who grew into a woman with sapphire eyes, a radiant smile, and a presence that filled a room. He belonged with her, to her, and he would devote his remaining time to ensuring her safety. "Naruko," he sighed around her name in an attempt to garner the weeping girl's attention. "Naruko," he tried again, his voice more insistent the second time around. When the girl continued to cry against him, He realized the only way to lift her out of her sorrow was to physically do so. And so, with a movement that belied his strength, Kurama wove one scarlet tail around the girl's waist and tucked her against his chest. Naruko was jolted from her despair as soft fur enveloped her waist. She gasped through a sob as she was gently lifted into the air. Kurama's form, warm and comforting, encased her in a tender embrace. She buried her face in his chest, trying to wipe away the remnants of her tears. Kurama let out a soft chuckle and tightened his hold, drawing her closer. She let out a small, frustrated sound before nestling deeper into his warmth, and there they remained in a shared, heartfelt embrace. Naruko, Kurama's voice resonated through her, given their close proximity. Do not weep for me, he murmured as he drew her even closer, feeling the fresh tears on her face. I would endure it all again for you, Naruko. Naruko's eyes widened in shock, and she attempted to extricate herself from Kurama's embrace, but he held her firm. Naruko, he gently commanded, his maw moving against her back, please, cease your struggle, and she became still. You have nothing to apologize for, my dear, Kurama continued, as she shook her head, her hair falling into her eyes. You rescued me from darkness, helped me reconcile with the other Baijuas, and liberated them from their bonds. His eyes closed in reflection. For you, I harbor nothing but gratitude, admiration, and pride. He nuzzled her more closely, her small figure almost completely obscured by his red fur. His next words came out as a low growl, the pain still evident in his tone. I had forsaken humanity, given up on them entirely, and resented Hagoromo for entrusting us with the protection of a world that did not deserve it. His voice softened. But perhaps the old man understood more than I ever gave him credit for. Kurama chuckled, and his laugh reverberated through Naruko's very being. I wonder if he glimpsed you when he came into this world, if he knew that our connection would not be forged through chains, but through a soul as radiant as the sunrise, symbolizing a new beginning. His voice lowered further. I wonder if he knew that I would find my way to you, to belong with you, and to you. As he spoke, Naruko was gently shifted, finding herself standing before his face, which rested on a folded arm. His crimson eyes were stormy as they met her own. I cannot restore your parents to you, Naruko, his gaze reflected regret, but I have been conserving my power and reserving some of yours. I have been accumulating chakra and keeping it from you, he confessed, his massive claw caressing her cheek, dwarfing her slender frame. Naruko's eyes widened as realization dawned upon her. If Kurama had been drawing her chakra while amassing his own, it would explain her fainting and prolonged unconsciousness. She searched his face for answers before asking, why would you do this, Kurama? His fingers gently tangled in her hair as he responded, I cannot return your parents to you, Naruko, his voice heavy with emotion. But I can send you back to them. Naruko's world seemed to spin as she stepped away from his touch. What? She gasped, shaking her head in disbelief. What do you mean, Kurama? Her eyes brimmed with fresh tears. Such a thing cannot be possible. Kurama nodded solemnly. I have found a way, he said gravely. It will require everything I have, but I can do it. I will do it for you, Naruko. He gently lifted her chin with a claw, urging her to meet his gaze. When her eyes met his, he continued, I can send you back to live the life you've always yearned for. His voice barely above a whisper now, a life with your parents, Naruko. Tears streamed down her face as she struggled to contain her sobs. Her grief pooled against the claw under her chin before trickling down her neck. After a moment of hesitation, she found her voice, though it sounded distant. And what? She breathed out, and what will become of you, Kurama? The claw beneath her jaw withdrew, as if to create a necessary distance. Despite his physical proximity, he felt miles away. When he spoke, she was astonished he had even heard her. Without me, he intoned, his words sounding alien to her. Without me, there would be no claw embedded in your parents' bellies, no demon residing within you. His explanation echoed hollowly in her mind, as though he should not be speaking at all, as if it were wrong to even listen to him. You will live a life free of hatred, he continued softly, his voice carrying a slow, persistent haunting quality. You can save those you love. You can find happiness. Naruko flinched as though struck. A profound emptiness settled in her chest, an isolation so consuming it seemed ready to engulf her. It felt like drowning. She held her future in her hands, with the power to save Sasuke's clan, preserve the life of the third Hokage, and prevent the loss of her beloved godfather, Jiraiya Sensei. The potential before her was boundless, offering the chance to reclaim all she had lost. Yet, the weight of this possibility bore down on her spine, failing to bring the anticipated joy. Her strength faltered, and her knees buckled beneath her. She descended quickly, silently, and without respite, kneeling before the colossal fox, whose eyes were cast downward as if unable to bear the sight of her. Naruko's golden hair fell against the floor, starkly contrasting with the surrounding darkness. She could not summon the strength to speak, her entire being aching with despair. She had endured a life of profound turmoil, waging battles fueled by hatred and sacrificing much of herself for the sake of those she cherished. The weight of her losses was immense. She and Kakashi would stand before the memorial stone, mourning in quiet sorrow. Death had been a constant companion, burdening her as she did the future. It left its mark on her every step, a shadow beneath her eyes, and a ghostly presence in her nightmares. Yet, she had loved with a depth she had never imagined possible, discovering a pure and formidable strength within herself. She had achieved what predecessors could not, bridging the divide between humanity and Baijiu. With the powers of the Ten Tails coursing through her veins, she healed the rift that had separated her and Sasuke. Together, they had rectified the mistakes that had shaped history's deepest lines. For the first time, the world had known peace. She, too, had come to experience the tranquility of peace. Her silver hair shone like platinum under the waning moon, her smile as gentle as the softest down. Her touch, capable of wielding lightning, radiated a warmth previously unknown to her. Her eyes, glowing with the hues of obsidian and crimson, only sought to meet his gaze. An embrace with him felt like coming home, a refuge amidst the chaos that had pervaded her life. Reflecting on her journey, Naruko saw the woman she had become amidst the devastation. Born into a world of isolation and hatred, she had once been driven by a volatile rage. Kurama, too, had harbored years of resentment. Yet, they had grown, learned, and persevered together, facing threats that sought to tear them apart. Kurama had been a constant presence throughout her life. The thought of living without him was a painful realization. She had come to understand that she loved Kurama as deeply as family. The chakra her parents had sealed within him had linked them eternally. Releasing him from his chains and merging their chakras had also felt like reuniting with her parents. Kurama's chakra had never departed from her side, and losing him would leave a void as deep as her own heartbeat. At that moment, Naruko felt a profound warmth, as if all her past suffering had finally made sense. The pain and anguish had only intensified her capacity for happiness and love, anchoring her hope. It was this strength that allowed her to save Kurama from a fate that once seemed inevitable. Without Kurama, she might not have had the power to save the world. Despite the possibility of rewriting history, she recognized the risk of a new calamity that could overwhelm her, leading to Konoha's loss. The thought of losing Kurama was unbearable, even if it meant enduring the absence of those she loved. As long as Kurama was with her, she could endure everything for him. Rising from her knees, she approached Kurama once more. His ears twitched at her footsteps. Kneeling beside him, she gently placed her palm over his closed eye, as if catching fallen tears. "Kurama," she whispered, her voice filled with adoration. The crimson of his eyes met her gaze, startled. "Silly fox," she murmured, resting her cheek on his snout, "I do not want a world without you." She pressed a kiss to his fur and continued, "I love my parents, and I miss them as you miss Hagoromo," she noted, with a tremor of fresh pain in her voice. "But I am who I am because of their sacrifices," she said, her voice steadying, "and I am who I am because of yours, too." Naruko drew back slightly to better view him, her hands gently framing his face with her tan fingers ensconced in scarlet fur. "You are in my veins, Kurama, in the very rhythm of my heart," she declared, her gaze unwavering as his eyes widened, pupils narrowing as though bracing for a blow. "I love you, foolish fox, I cannot and will not let you go." Kurama stared at the woman before him in stunned silence. Her face, flushed with blue and gold hues, was streaked with tears, yet her eyes held a softness he had never seen before. The firmness of her jaw revealed her determination. It struck him as strange that, after preparing himself for a farewell, she was refusing to part, unwilling to utter the words of goodbye. He had long been aware of his deep affection for her but had never considered that she might share his feelings. The secrecy now seemed absurd. He could have simply asked her from the start, and perhaps she wouldn't have been so entangled. A wave of guilt weighed heavily on him as he realized it was unfair to have presumed her feelings. He opened his mouth to speak. "Naruko, but she placed a hand on his snout, silencing him. "None of that, Kurama," she said, her fingers gently stroking his fur. "I am deeply grateful for your care." She leaned in to kiss his snout, her golden hair cascading over his eyes and bathing him in a warm glow. "Thank you for being willing to sacrifice yourself for me." Her lips brushed his muzzle lightly. "I couldn't endure a world without you, you silly fox." As fresh tears trickled into his fur, Kurama encircled his caretaker with a tail, offering a comforting embrace. He permitted the diminutive woman to continue her tender ministrations, planting kisses on his face and caressing the sides of his jaw. Throughout his existence, Kurama had felt adrift, like a vessel lost at sea. The profound loneliness and lack of purpose had weighed heavily on him. Yet, in an unexpected turn of events, a boisterous blonde with blue eyes had opened her heart to him with boundless affection. Despite his initial resistance, surrendering to her embrace felt akin to finding home. Kurama grinned against Naruko's stomach, exhaling a soft breath to capture her attention. The gentle gust caused her to lean back, her gaze inquisitive as their eyes met. "If I cannot return you to your parents, what would you have me do, Naruko?" he inquired. A vivid memory surged within Naruko, a flash of silver, a gleam of crimson, a hand enveloping her own. An intense yearning gripped her heart, eliciting a gasp from her lips. Her hand instinctively clutched the fabric over her heart, and with a tender voice, she requested, "Please, return me to him," her hand falling to soothe Kurama's snout. Kurama's grin widened, revealing his large ivory teeth. "Him, you say?" He responded with a hint of amusement, noticing Naruko's cheeks flush with color. "You hold him in high regard, don't you?" He dismissed the idea with a scoff. "He may be a bit mature for my taste, but I suppose he will suffice." Naruko's eyes widened in surprise at his approval before she smiled back, her unique birthmarks curving upward in response. "Yes, he will do," she said, leaning down to kiss the fox once more. "Please, Kurama," she whispered softly, her words nearly inaudible. "Return me to him." Kurama nodded in agreement, the movement causing Naruko to shift. Rising up and away from her, his massive form loomed over her. His voice resonated in the mindscape, its volume startling her after their quiet exchange. "Well then, Naruko," he boomed, "it is time we return you to him. He has been rather brooding in your absence. It does no good to leave the poor man moping," he added with a chuckle. "He looks more pitiful than a kicked kitten." Suddenly, the world tilted on its axis and spun away from Naruko. She closed her eyes against the disorienting sight, her stomach churning as if it were rising to her throat. Clenching her jaw, she curled into a ball, struggling to alleviate the dizziness. Just as she thought she could endure no more, the world came to a jarring halt, leaving behind a profound silence. Panic surged through Naruko. She feared something had gone awry, that Kurama's technique had failed, and she was back where she began. Her heart raced against her ribs, and a high-pitched ringing filled her ears. Despair threatened to overwhelm her. She wanted to cry out, to find Kurama and tell him something had gone wrong. She gripped her hair in frustration, her body trembling with apprehension. A faint sound pierced the ringing, a soft rustling, as if someone were shifting. She gasped and stilled, straining her senses. Though she questioned whether she had actually heard anything, a sigh, though distant, registered to her right. Her heart skipped a beat. A gentle touch brushed her hand, and Naruko held her breath. Suddenly, awareness flooded over her. She felt the sheets against her skin, her bangs falling to the sides of her face, and the pillow beneath her head. Realizing she was in a hospital suite overlooking Konoha, she inwardly smiled, knowing that Tsunade had placed her there intentionally so she could continue watching over the village even in her condition. The room smelled of tears and wildflowers, and a monitor beeped steadily to her left, tracking her heart rate. A band encircled her left wrist, and she felt smaller than she remembered. Recalling the sigh, Naruko's desperation to locate its source grew. Fingers gently traced her wrist, and warmth enveloped her. Kakashi. Her heart leapt at the recognition. His voice, soft and rhythmic, was counting her pulse despite the machine's readings. Elation surged through her, nearly bringing her to tears. It was truly him, and the joy of being near him again after such a long absence was overwhelming. The thought of tears reminded Naruko of her profound need to see Kakashi, to behold his face and witness the relief that would wash over him upon her awakening. She longed to trace his features, to see his eyes one last time. Driven by this intense yearning, she fought against the pull of unconsciousness with sheer desperation, determined to reunite with the man she loved. She felt as though she had been submerged and had finally surfaced for air. The heaviness of her eyelids was unfamiliar, yet she could sense the movement of her eyes beneath them. Her lashes brushed against her cheek, eager to lift away. Brief flashes of light flickered in her vision, intensifying her longing. At last, her eyes opened, and Naruko was overwhelmed by the scene before her. The colors merged into a chaotic blur, a jumbled spectrum she struggled to comprehend after her long immersion. She held her breath and blinked repeatedly, trying to impose order on the shifting shapes. Gray mingled with pale tones, blending into black and descending into navy. It was then that Naruko realized Kakashi was not wearing his vest. As her vision adjusted, she began to make out the contours of his jaw, the slope of his neck, and the curve of his shoulders. His hair was disheveled, falling haphazardly over his ears and into his eyes. The subtle hollows beneath his cheekbones struck her with an unexpected pang of sadness. She gasped involuntarily, her breath hitching, and after what felt like an eternity, her vision cleared, and she saw Kakashi's obsidian and garnet eyes meeting hers with unprecedented clarity. Tears welled up in the eyes she had yearned for, and Kakashi's mouth hung open, suspended around the beginning of her name. Naruko dared not blink, fearing she might lose him forever. His hand, resting around hers, twitched, a gentle touch that felt as electrifying as a chidori against her palm. Frozen in place, her eyes wide with innocence, she waited for Kakashi to act, to speak, to lift them from this moment that seemed eternal. She heard the scrape of his shoe against the floor, his breath intake as he leaned forward, the rustle of his pants as he rose from his chair, and finally, his voice softly uttering her name. Naru. Kakashi breathed, his voice as gentle as falling rain. Naruko? He whispered, leaning closer, his face hovering above hers. Naruko was overcome, her breath caught in her throat as the proximity ignited every nerve ending. His mask was down, gray stubble visible along his jawline. Somewhere in the recesses of her mind, she mourned the bruises beneath his eyes. He moved slowly, as though time itself had stretched, and her heart raced as his thumb finally rested against her cheek. An errant tear fell from Kakashi's chin and landed on hers. She inhaled, feeling the warmth leave her hand as he placed his other hand on the opposite side of her face. His tear-filled gaze questioned her, and Naruko managed to nod. That simple gesture sparked something in Kakashi's eyes, a light that dispelled the darkness that had plagued them. Then, in a heartbeat, Kakashi's lips met hers, igniting a flame within her. His lips were softer than she remembered, tender and familiar, merging with hers in a way that felt like coming home. His chest pressed against hers, and she wondered if he could feel the tumultuous beating of her heart. Tears cascaded down her cheeks, dripping onto her chin and pooling at the hollow of her throat. Kakashi trembled, a physical sign of sorrow she had never witnessed from him before. As he pulled away, Naruko mourned the loss of his warmth. Overcome with emotion, Kakashi wrapped his arms around her, one hand gripping the space between her shoulders and the other spanning her lower back. His fingers pressed into her as he held her close. He gasped her name, the sound so poignant it threatened to shatter her heart, and after 3 heartbeats, he buried his face in the crook of her neck and wept. "Oh, Kakashi, Naruko sighed, embracing him as best as she could. She ran her fingers through his silver hair, working out the tangles, while her other hand rubbed soothing circles on his back. His tears soaked into her hospital gown. There, Kakashi, she said, her voice hoarse from disuse but determined to reach him. It's okay, Kakashi, I am here, she repeated, I'm here. She held him tighter, whispering gentle reassurances, pressing kiss after kiss to the crown of his head, and nuzzling him with her chin. She continued until his trembling ceased, spent from the ordeal. Even as he fell still, Naruko could still feel his tears, smell the sorrow-laced salt on him, and hear his labored breathing. She wrestled with relief at having him back and remorse for the pain she had caused. You can't blame yourself, Kit, Kurama's voice echoed in her mind, pulling her from her self-reproach. It was my jutsu that took you from him, it was not your choice to leave him. Naruko frowned at his words, which, though rational, did little to ease the heaviness in her chest. Sensing this, Kurama spoke again. He could not love you, you know, he said with a dismissive scoff. But then his words registered, and Naruko's thoughts jolted to attention. He can't, she replied, Kakashi couldn't. And Kurama's laughter echoed through her mind. Come now, Naruko, his amusement was evident as he spoke. Surely you must have known. Why else, he queried, would he be so distraught and overwhelmed with emotion at having you back in his arms? His tone shifted to seriousness. If the fool were not in love with you. He observed her as she tried to compose herself, her thoughts flashing before him. He wondered how someone with immense power could be so oblivious to those around her. Naruko's thoughts were disjointed, and he was faced with fragmented images of Kakashi. He turned away when more intimate moments appeared in her mind, though he noted that she lingered on them longer than the others. He scoffed, realizing she was in love herself, yet oblivious to it. After what felt like an interminable period to Kurama, Naruko finally calmed. He sensed the tranquility radiating from her, which even extended to his own chakra, easing his heart. He exhaled in relief, recognizing that Naruko was finally herself again. He had anticipated that seeing Kakashi would cause her emotional turmoil and guilt, so he had withheld her chakra to prevent the village from realizing its hero had returned. This way, they could reconnect without the village's intrusive scrutiny. It was his way of compensating for his role in the situation. Naruko needed time to reconcile her actions and feelings, and Kakashi required time to accept Naruko's return. Naruko had not even noticed the absence of her chakra, so absorbed was she in Kakashi and her remorse. Kurama chuckled at her, knowing that despite her sage abilities, she rarely looked inward. Hey, Naruko, he called, pulling her from her reverie. Do you not think it's time? Her eyes widened in confusion before he continued, have you not noticed, Kit, he asked, that your chakra is still suppressed? His grin reappeared in her mind, and she sighed, realizing her ignorance. I hadn't noticed, she admitted, curiosity piqued. Why have you kept it repressed? Her blue eyes shone with confusion in his mental landscape. His grin faded as he explained, I thought it best to give you both a moment to reconnect. Kurama's ears folded back as he spoke. It is time, Naruko, he whispered, his voice tinged with anticipation. I need the space to expand my power, and your chakra must return to you. I cannot bear it alone, he chuckled, it still amazes me how you manage it. Naruko smiled warmly at her companion, her grin brightening the darkness. She nodded in agreement. Nay, Kurama, she murmured as warmth spread through her, her first coils slowly unwinding. Thank you, she said, pressing a lingering kiss to Kurama's muzzle. The mindscape burst into warmth, thank you. Naruko kissed his snout and laughed as power surged through her veins. She turned her focus outward. Exhaustion faded as her chakra surged, and she stifled a laugh on Kakashi's head as energy coursed beneath her skin. She reveled in the revitalization, feeling her power expand and press against a barrier. It pushed with such force that it warmed her bones. With a gasp, the barrier shattered as if a dam had broken. Naruko's once tarnished hair gleamed with sunlight, her skin shed the winter's chill, and color returned to her form. Her cheeks, now vibrant with the vitality of spring, were tinted like a blooming rose. Her lips healed, and her nails realigned, muscles in her hands taut once more. She flexed them experimentally, delighted by their restored function. With her chakra restored, her heightened senses returned. Kakashi's hair felt like cool silk against her fingers. She traced his cheekbones, sensing his chakra responding to her touch, pulling beneath her palm. Every point of contact between their bodies simmered with a barely contained heat. Naruko longed to awaken him, to feel his lips on hers, to lose herself in him. However, a jolt of anxiety interrupted her thoughts. The door exploded open, its hinges groaning as it gave way. Tsunade stood amid the wreckage, her honey-colored eyes wide with shock. Her hair was disheveled, the ponytails undone from the force of her entry. Tears streamed down her cheeks, leaving trails of dust in their wake, her mouth agape as she called out Naruko's name. Naruko felt a surge of remorse at the sight of her godmother. Such despair was rare on Tsunade's face, only comparable to when Naruko had blamed her for Jiraiya's death, overwhelmed by her own grief. The second instance was at his burial, when Naruko, despite knowing Jiraiya would want celebration, was consumed by her sorrow. Naruko inhaled deeply as a sob threatened to escape. The sound jolted Tsunade from her daze, and Naruko could only watch as the once steady Hokage stumbled forward towards her. "It is," Tsunade murmured, shaking her head in disbelief as her disheveled bangs fell haphazardly against her chin. "It truly is you," she whispered as she finally approached the bedside. "You're..." She hesitated, her pale hand reaching towards Naruko, though it trembled noticeably. "You're awake." She exhaled, releasing a stream of chakra that flowed gently over Naruko's form, melting into her skin. Naruko realized she had been holding her breath, feeling the probing energy traverse her veins, and stifled a laugh when Kurama growled in response to the intrusion. Tsunade flinched but then sighed with relief, reassured by the spark of demonic energy that met her touch. Her shoulders relaxed, and the tension in her spine dissipated, causing her knees to almost give way for the first time in years. She steadied herself, withdrawing from Naruko's presence, and focused on the girl before her. She had not initially noticed Kakashi, who lay beside Naruko, his form overshadowing hers. His head rested against her neck, his white hair close to his scalp, and he remained silent in his sleep. Had Tsunade not possessed such keen medical senses, she might have missed the almost imperceptible rise and fall of his back, signaling his breath. She offered a small smile of gratitude at the sight. Tsunade had been deeply concerned for Kakashi, monitoring his condition and listening to his troubled dreams. Seeing him in such a peaceful state, his face free of the frown and despair that often marked it, alleviated the last of her anxieties. Her gaze shifted from Kakashi to Naruko, noting with joy that the bruises and hollows in Naruko's face had vanished. Her vitality had returned, reminiscent of the day Jiraiya had brought her to Tsunade's door. Naruko blushed under her godmother's gaze and discreetly shielded Kakashi's face with a sweeping motion of her hand. Tsunade caught the gesture and Naruko seized the opportunity to infuse her chakra into the touch. Tsunade's pallid skin glowed, her complexion evened out, the dark circles under her eyes diminished, and her hair regained its luster. The wrinkles smoothed away as if they had never existed, and the diamond on her forehead radiated with renewed chakra. Naruko exhaled, relieved to see Tsunade's hands steady once more. Tsunade clasped Naruko's fingers, then leaned down to kiss her forehead. As her lips met Naruko's skin, she whispered, "Welcome home," her voice quivering as she added, "As acting Hokage in the interim, I forbid you from leaving again." Naruko nodded immediately, but the gesture was halted by Tsunade's hand resting gently on her face. The legendary Sannin bowed her head and placed a lingering kiss on Naruko's cheek. Naruko felt the warmth of Tsunade's touch before it faded, replaced by the gentle traces of smoke signaling her departure. Grinning in the ensuing silence, Naruko felt a sense of relief, knowing she had eased Tsunade's worry. Her focus shifted to Kakashi, whose suffering she now sought to address. With careful precision, she adjusted his position so that his head rested against her stomach. She resumed combing his hair with a tender touch, her hands glowing with a warm light as she transferred her energy to him. She felt a deep connection with him as her senses synchronized with his. His chakra channels, initially sluggish, soon responded to her nurturing touch. Kakashi sighed in his sleep, his breath brushing the thin hospital gown she wore. His gentle nuzzling caused a jolt of energy to course through her, accelerating her chakra flow. She watched as his pallid skin regained its vitality. The color, reminiscent of freshly fallen snow, was always warm to the touch, as though restrained lightning coursed through his veins. The light infused into his lips, smoothing away the dryness and restoring them. She marveled as the darkness beneath his eyes faded, revealing the softest white she had ever seen. Gently, she brushed her thumb over his face, admiring his serene beauty. Kakashi leaned into her touch, trapping her hand against his cheek. Strands of his hair, now silky, brushed against her fingers, drawing her gaze to his face. His hair, illuminated with a moonlit glow, captivated her. She stared, wide-eyed and transfixed, as he looked more resplendent than she had ever seen, fearing that even a blink might cause him to vanish from her world forever. She tightened her grip around him, the hand splayed against his back trembling with unconstrained apprehension. She needed him, she realized, more than she needed anyone else. The thought of it tugged painfully at her heart, bringing fresh tears to her eyes. Kakashi, sensing her distress, stirred from his sleep. His form appeared indistinct, but she could discern the hesitant opening of his eyes, fleeting glimpses of crimson and onyx, as her world seemed to tilt. A sob caught in Naruko's throat, and despite her efforts to suppress it, the sound escaped her. She moved to wipe away the tears, but her hands were gently held in place. She gasped and tried to pull away from Kakashi's grasp, but his presence drew her in. Kakashi, her frustrated growl was cut short by his kiss, which overwhelmed her senses. The kiss was intense and consuming, like plunging into the heart of a blazing inferno. Kakashi's chakra flowed back into her, mingling with his lightning affinity and electrifying her nerves. His lips pried open hers, and she surrendered to him, overwhelmed by the realization of how much she had missed him. As his tongue met hers, Naruko felt herself drowning in the depth of their connection. The kiss was desperate and unrelenting, leaving Naruko yearning for more with every motion. Kakashi tangled his fingers in her hair while she gripped his back, their movements fueled by an insatiable hunger. Kakashi briefly pulled away for air, and Naruko tightened her legs around him. Amid their breathless exchanges, Kakashi's murmured name sounded like a sweet promise. Naruko, gasping, tried to drink in every sensation of him, determined to hold on until her lungs felt empty, even if it meant she would perish rather than part from him. Yet, Kakashi had other plans. He drew back, their breaths mingling. Pressing a softer kiss to her lips, he brought his forehead to hers. Their eyes met, and Naruko could see the myriad of emotions swirling within his gaze, lust that warmed her, admiration that reddened her cheeks, happiness that made her smile, and relief that mirrored her own. Finally, his expression took on a gravity that chilled her to the core. Still pinned beneath him, Naruko could feel his every breath against her ribs. The intensity of his gaze made her brace herself as if for impact. Seeing this, Kakashi's eyes softened, revealing a desperation so profound that it made her heart skip a beat. "You can't," he whispered, pausing as he struggled to contain his emotions. "You cannot do that again, Naruko." Tears formed in his eyes, as if pleading with her never to leave him again. She nodded in response, her gesture a silent affirmation of her commitment, hoping to convey that she would rather die than part from him once more. As his eyes closed halfway, Naruko gently wiped the tears from his cheek, her thumb brushing his scar, guiding him back to another kiss. This kiss was not a wildfire but a steady, unifying burn, as if they were melding into one. Naruko gave everything she had, aware that without Kakashi, she would be incomplete. She needed him to understand the depth of her feelings, to recognize and ingrain them in his own heart. He seemed to grasp her unspoken vow, nodding against her lips, drawing closer and kissing her repeatedly until the air was spent. Only when all was exhausted did Kakashi finally pull away, his eyes reflecting emotions he couldn't yet articulate in their intimate sanctuary. Naruko perceived and felt these emotions deeply, finding them to be the most profound of her experiences. Kakashi kissed her forehead, moved off her, and gazed out at the rising sun. It was dawn, and as she observed Kakashi bathed in the soft morning light, she marveled at his otherworldly beauty. She committed to memory every detail of him, as if he belonged to the moon. Noticing her contemplation, Kakashi looked at her with a small grin, the early sunlight creating a halo around him. "They know you're back," he said with a laugh, placing a gentle hand over hers. "They'll want to see you." Naruko's eyes widened, and she smiled in response. "Better grab your mask, Kakashi," she replied with a giggle, rising from the bed with a sense of relief. Her feet made little sound as they touched the floor, and she felt an internal cheer at her regained mobility. Her playful indignation was triggered by a finger flicking her forehead, her eyes flashing with mock annoyance. Despite his serene smile, she pouted. Before her hair had even settled, he pulled her into his arms, his scent of fresh linen and aspen trees soothing her. With his chin resting on her head, he spoke gently. "Ma, Naruko," he teased, stroking her hair. "It's not nice to tease your sensei." She scoffed against his chest to hide a laugh. "Whatever you say, sensei," she mocked as she grabbed the mask from his back pocket. Then, with a move too quick even for Kakashi, she chucked the thing out the window. Kakashi blinked once, twice, before immediately moving to stop it in its descent. Naruko laughed then, a bright, loud sound that echoed outside the hospital window. The voices below, calling her name, finally captured her attention. She peered out cautiously as a figure clad in gray and silver descended to the ground, his mask already in place. With a languid wave of his hand, he signaled her, it was time. Naruko's beaming smile was the only warning the crowd received before her chakra surged around her. In a single, fluid motion, she leapt from the window and descended gracefully to the assembly below, akin to a shooting star. A subtle crater formed beneath her feet upon impact. Embarrassed, she glanced down, realizing that her enthusiasm had led her to overlook her usual restraint. She absent-mindedly brushed her hair back, vexed that she had forgotten to style it into her trademark twin ponytails. It now cascaded well past her hips, though she noted with some relief that Tsunade had remembered to trim her bangs to prevent them from obstructing her view. She resolved to thank her godmother later before refocusing on the crowd before her. Tears of joy welled in her eyes as she took in the sight of her friends, each face reflecting similar elation. Her gaze briefly met the silver-haired Jounin, who nodded in understanding, as if acknowledging her profound emotion at the sight of Konoha's entire populace before her. It was a poignant affirmation of her place in the world, a celebration of her existence, and an earnest display of love and admiration. She felt a deep sense of belonging. A tear slid down her cheek as she turned her attention back to the crowd. Her golden hair shimmered with the movement, and her eyes took on a vivid burnt orange hue as she activated her sage senses to connect with every heartbeat in the vicinity. Her chakra, now liberated from its restraints, flowed to each individual, invigorating them as it had previously done for Tsunade and Kakashi. The unspoken message was clear: Naruko had returned. At last, she was home. A moment of silence enveloped the village, as if the entire community exhaled in relief before Konoha erupted in jubilant cheers. Thank you for your time. I hope the content was engaging for you. Thank you for watching. Grateful. Anime Octopus.